In the winter of 1944, a freight train slowed to a halt in the bitter cold of Wisconsin. The metal doors swung open with a clang, and dozens of Japanese soldiers stepped out onto the snow-covered ground. They squinted against the pale light, their eyes sunken, their cheeks hollow, their lips cracked from hunger and weeks of meager rations. The long journey from the Pacific had stripped them of everything: their strength, their dignity, their belief that death was preferable to capture. From their first day in the Imperial Army, they had learned the same lesson. Being taken prisoner was the deepest shame. Surrender was dishonor. Surrender was worse than death. Rumors had crossed the ocean with them. The Americans tortured, starved, humiliated to the limit. Many prepared themselves for execution the moment they left the train car. But what they saw did not resemble the promised hell, and that, in a way, frightened them even more. Before them stretched rows of wooden barracks covered in frost. Watchtowers rose against the white sky, rifles in the hands of the sentries. Barbed wire outlined the contours of captivity. But the environment was not chaotic. There was order, routine, a strange normality. Trucks crossed the internal roads, and thick smoke rose from the kitchen chimneys, bringing with it a smell impossible to ignore. Food, real food, rich, fatty, hot. An aroma so strong that it hurt bodies accustomed to thin soup and watery rice. The prisoners looked at each other suspiciously. Some kept their eyes fixed on the ground, trying to erase any trace of curiosity. Others just trembled, motionless. The guards shouted orders in English, firm voices, but not angry ones. Interpreters repeated in Japanese, "Line up, move forward, don't break formation." And then they saw something that confused them even more. Men with clipboards and armbands marked with a red cross were watching everything. Representatives of the Red Cross, neutral. There, among enemies, were people monitoring the treatment of prisoners. Their mere presence contradicted years of propaganda. They had been told that America was barbaric, lawless, indifferent to treaties, and yet rules were being followed before their very eyes. The reception process began with almost mechanical precision. Each man was disinfected, his filthy clothes burned. Doctors examined them for fever, broken bones, malnutrition. A soldier with an arm wound already wrapped in a dirty cloth expected to be ignored. Instead, an American doctor knelt down, removed the bandage, cleaned the wound, and applied another, clean one with firm, careful movement. The Japanese man stood motionless, unable to understand what he was seeing. Care, coming from the hands of the enemy. "Why would they do that?" he whispered to his companion beside him. "We are not theirs. We are nothing." The other simply replied, "It's a trick. Wait." But the trick never came. Each new stage seemed to challenge what they knew. There was no torture, but protocol. There were no screams, but instructions. The fear did not disappear. It just changed form. Now it was the fear of the inexplicable. Once the examinations were over, the prisoners were led across the snow-covered courtyard to their quarters. The sound of boots on ice repeated in unison. They expected cold, hard floors, hunger. Instead, they found heated barracks, lined beds, wool blankets. The smell of smoke and burnt iron filled the air. One or two sat down slowly, running their hands over the mattresses, as if afraid that the comfort would disappear at their touch. Outside, the barbed wire reminded everyone of what they were, captives. But inside, what they saw challenged everything they had believed. The guards did not curse them, kick them, or make them crawl. There was discipline, but no sadism. It was a captivity governed by rules, and that disoriented them more than any violence. At night, the camp fell silent. The fires in the stoves crackled, and for the first time in months, their bodies fell asleep warm. Some tried to resist the sensation, fearing that comfort would weaken them. Others simply gave in to exhaustion. In the dark, confused thoughts mingled. If the enemy wasn't going to torture them, what would they do instead? Dawn brought more surprises. Instead of aggression, the sound of a bugle echoed in the cold air. The sound surprised them not because it was strange, but because it was familiar, the same melody that woke them up in the camps in Japan. For a moment they forgot where they were. Then came the firm voices in English, calling them to formation. The interpreter explained the rules of the camp. They would be fed, they would have shelter, they could write letters, they would work, but within the limits of the Geneva Convention. The silence that followed was heavy. "These are not promises," said the man. "They are laws, laws." For men who had learned that war knew no limits, The word sounded absurd. Some bowed their heads in shame, as if being treated with dignity were a humiliation. The medical exams returned. The Americans noted weights and blood pressure and distributed white pills. Vitamins, they said. The prisoners accepted them with suspicion. Medicine given by the enemy seemed more like an insult than a kindness. In the afternoon they received new clothes, simple uniforms marked with the letters PW, prisoner of war. The clothes were clean and fit well. For those who had come from the torn and bloody front lines, the feel of the firm fabric was almost a blow to the conscience. Outside, the guards remained alert, but not hostile. When an elderly man slipped on the ice, an American soldier grabbed him by the arm and helped him up. No words, no mockery, just a gesture and a nod before moving on. That night, disbelief spread through the barracks. "Do you believe them?" asked one. "They talk about rules, as if this were an agreement." Another replied, "It's a pretense. They'll show their true colors when they think we're weak." But time passed, and nothing changed. The next day the Red Cross returned. They checked the facilities, the rations, the procedures. Everything seemed to follow a cold and predictable logic. For the prisoners, this predictability was almost unbearable. Cruelty, at least, made sense. Organization did not. At night, as the wind blew outside, many remained awake, listening to the creaking of the wood and the crackling of the fire. The world they had known, one of blind obedience, of honor until death, seemed to dissolve with each passing day. In the heart of the enemy country they were alive, warm, fed, and above all, treated with humanity. But it was this humanity that disturbed them most. They didn't know whether to feel relief or shame. The war still raged beyond the wire, but inside the camp something different was beginning. A kind of silence that did not spring from fear, but from confusion. None of them could have predicted that the real shock was yet to come. It would not come from weapons or punishment. It would come from a tray, the smell of hot meat, and a glass bottle clinking with gas trapped inside. The enemy, they soon discovered, could not only hurt them, it could feed them. And this form of kindness would be, for many, the most difficult to bear. The next morning, the cold Wisconsin air seemed heavier. The prisoners, still stunned by the silent discipline of the camp, lined up in front of the cafeteria. The floor creaked under their boots. The smoke coming out of the chimney carried a thick, tempting smell, something that awakened their stomachs, and, at the same time, their suspicion. During the walk, few exchanged words. Fear still accompanied them like a persistent shadow. If brutality had not arrived on the first day, perhaps it would come now, disguised as routine. Inside, the sound was different from what they had imagined for an enemy camp. No shouting, no pushing, just the sizzling of frying pans, the clattering of shells against metal trays, and the distant murmur of voices speaking English. An interpreter repeated the instructions. "Follow the line. Get your food. Sit down. No messing around." Simple, straightforward, and yet impossible to believe. When the first man reached the counter, he saw the enemy up close. An American cook, sleeves rolled up, face reddened by the heat of the kitchen. He held a spatula, and with a firm motion placed a piece of steaming meat on the bread. Then he added something golden and crispy, French fries, and finally a cold, wet, clear glass bottle. The label, red and curved, was indecipherable, but familiar in its harmony. The Japanese man held the tray with trembling hands. For a second he thought it was a provocation. The smell was strong, almost intoxicating. Behind him his companions watched, exchanging quick glances. "It's meat," whispered one. "Real meat." The sound of caps being opened filled the hall. A metallic click, followed by the hiss of escaping gas, psst, echoed in the air, and dozens of eyes turned to the bottles, as if they contained something alive. "Coca-Cola," explained an American soldier with disinterest. For the Japanese, it was an empty word, meaningless, but the contents glowed like something forbidden. They sat down at long wooden tables. Some stared at their plates for long seconds without touching them. Others sniffed the bread suspiciously. A thin soldier with deep-set eyes raised the glass to his lips and took a small sip. The sweetness hit him first, then the gas, burning his throat and making him cough. Several looked at him, alarmed. He clutched his chest and began to laugh, a nervous, almost childish laugh. The laughter spread, brief, muffled, but alive. For the first time in months, inside a prison camp, something resembling humanity was heard. Next to him, another man lifted his hamburger with both hands. The bread was soft and warm, the meat juicy. When he bit into it, the fat dripped down his chin. He stopped chewing and lowered his head. His shoulders shook. He was crying, silently. "I had forgotten the taste of fat," he murmured. At that moment, the meal was no longer just food. It was an internal collapse, a crack in the moral structure built by the empire that had educated them. They had been taught that the enemy was barbaric, hungry, morally corrupt, but before them, the enemy served hot meat and sweet drinks, naturally, without ostentation, without debauchery, just like someone repeating a habit. One of the prisoners commented quietly in a bitter tone, "They fatten us up to make us forget who we are." His companion replied with cutting frankness, "Maybe they just eat like this every day." This hypothesis was more disturbing than any plan of manipulation. As they chewed, shame and amazement mingled. For men who had survived months of hunger and disease, that simple dish seemed like luxury. The noise of bottles being set down on tables and metal trays clinking created an improvised music, the sound of beliefs crumbling. In the corners of the hall, the guards ate the same food. No gestures of superiority, no displays of power. It was just Tuesday. Everyday American life, reflected in meat and sugar. Normality became the most devastating weapon. All of Japan had told them that the enemy was on the verge of collapse, but there, in the midst of war, they saw plenty, routine, abundance. And what was worse, they saw all this being offered to them, defeated prisoners. At the end of the meal, the men sat motionless, their hands on their empty trays. Some looked at each other in silence, others stared at the wall, trying to understand what they had experienced. It was as if they had crossed over into another world, a world where food was not rationed, where sweetness was wasted in bottles delivered even to those who had lost. The bell rang, calling them back to their ranks. The voices of the guards led them back to the barracks. They walked slowly, their stomachs full, their minds in turmoil. For men accustomed to deprivation, feeling satiated was almost unbearable. One of them commented quietly, without looking at the others, "If this is the enemy, what were we?" At night, lying in their heated beds, the memory of that lunch haunted them. The taste still lingered in their mouths, the gas still burned in their throats. Every sip of Coca-Cola, every bite of hamburgers seemed to carry an impossible moral weight. Some prayed silently, asking their ancestors for forgiveness for having enjoyed the enemy's food. Others, exhausted, just closed their eyes, not daring to admit that the taste had awakened something forgotten in them, pleasure. The psychological shock was so profound that, in the days that followed, the tone of conversation in the camp changed. People no longer talked only about survival, but about comparison. The Americans, some said, seemed to live in a parallel world, immune to war. They had resources, they had time, they had sweetness. How could such a powerful empire treat prisoners with such normality? What did it mean, after all, to be civilized? With each new meal, the doubt grew. The food always came hot. The guards maintained the same distant and firm behavior. Everything followed the rules. And the more the rules were followed, the more fragile the certainties they brought from the front seemed. On the third night, a soldier wrote on a piece of paper that he intended to hide under his mattress, "The enemy did not break me with sword. They broke me with bread and sugar." From then on, the camp ceased to be just a place of confinement. It became a mirror. The reflection they saw was not that of the enemy. It was that of their own humanity, which they had tried to deny in the name of war. Around the campfires, the conversations became almost philosophical. "They treat us like men," said one prisoner. "But doesn't that make them weak?" Another replied, "Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe their strength is not needing to hate us." The silence that followed was more eloquent than any speech. None of them would have dared to repeat this aloud in front of their superiors, but they knew something inside them had changed. The hamburger and Coca-Cola were not just a meal. They were the first direct contact with a truth that the entire camp was beginning to realize. The enemy did not need cruelty to win. Normality was enough. It was enough to live as if the war had no power over everyday life. In that Wisconsin cold, far from the trenches and imperial flags, the Japanese prisoners understood that war was not just a conflict of weapons, but of worlds, and that sometimes the most devastating blow comes in the form of a trivial gesture, a meal served without hatred, a soda offered without scorn. As the lights in the camp went out, some still ruminated on the memory of the sweet taste, the sound of the gas escaping, the soft bread melting in their mouths. Others just stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Outside, The guards collected the empty bottles, stacking them without realizing that, in that simple ritual, they had defeated an enemy without firing a shot. And amid the silence of the early morning, history took its course. A story that still echoes when we remember that sometimes it is humanity, not force, that truly wins wars. The days following the first hamburger passed with a strange regularity. Each morning began with the bugle call, the cold air cutting into our faces, the crunch of boots on ice, and the voices of the guards calling us to line up. The Camp McCoy prison camp functioned like a precision machine. Schedule, orders, meals, work. There was no room for surprises, and yet everything was surprising. The absence of cruelty continued to confuse the men. After breakfast, always hot, always served without insults, came the assignment. Some were taken to clear snow from the internal roads, others to chop wood or carry boxes. Those in good health were sent to nearby farms, where they helped harvest potatoes or repair fences under the supervision of American soldiers. The work was hard, but not destructive, and once again, they were paid for it. Each prisoner received coupons that could be exchanged at the canteen for stationery, soap, cigarettes, or even candy. The first time a Japanese man saw a chocolate bar on the shelf, he stood still, as if looking at a mirage. "In Japan," he muttered, "this is medicine. Here, it's just food." His companion next to him just shook his head. It didn't make sense. Nothing in that place did. The canteen became a kind of window to another world. The prisoners watched the American soldiers laughing, buying soft drinks, chewing gum, as if the war didn't exist. The naturalness of consumption was an open wound. Japan was fighting for every last grain of rice, and there, the enemy seemed to live without scarcity. Each can of soda was an affront, but also a fascination. At night, after work, some prisoners wrote letters. They could send 2 per month, and every word was reviewed by censors. Still, the men bent over the paper, focused, trying to condense their lives into a few lines. "I'm alive," that's what almost everyone said. Few had the courage to write what they really felt, that they ate well, that they were warm, that the enemy treated them with a dignity they did not expect. The letters back arrived slowly, laden with pain. One prisoner received news that his wife and children were living on bark and roots in Osaka. He read the letter in silence, his hands trembling. In the distance, the smell of American dinner, meat and fresh bread, floated in the air. "How can I eat when my children are starving?" he whispered. No one answered. The weight of the contradiction was shared by all. Over time, the camp began to create its own rituals. Some prisoners carved small wooden toys during their free time. Others improvised games, drew pictures, or just stared at the horizon, imagining what remained of Japan. Barbed wire confined their bodies, but their thoughts wandered far away, sometimes with longing, sometimes with guilt. The American guards were rarely hostile. Many performed their duties without even raising their voices. There was a young man named Miller who used to stop by the tents after work. He carried photographs of his family in his pocket and showed them to the prisoner, his father, mother, and 2 little sisters smiling. The Japanese looked at the pictures in silence, some bowing their heads in a gesture of respect. Then one of them traced the outline of a house and a woman in a kimono in the dirt with his finger. "Ha ha ha," he said, pointing. "Chi-chi." The American soldier smiled and replied slowly, "Mother, father." For a few seconds there were no guards or prisoners, just 2 men exchanging memories of home. But the war was still alive inside the camp, even when the outside world seemed distant. There were those who saw the Americans' behavior as a trap, a way to tame the Japanese spirit. "They want to tame us with kindness," said a hoarse-voiced sergeant. "Every smile they give us is poison." Others, too tired and hungry to sustain the rhetoric of honor, replied, "Poison that feeds us is still better than death." The discussions became heated, and sometimes the guards had to intervene. A few began attending English classes offered by the American. At first it was more out of curiosity than real interest. They repeated simple words, bread, table, water, and laughed at their mangled pronunciations. "Famry," said one, trying to say family, and everyone burst out laughing, including the instructor. That laughter was not mockery. It was human. After so much time in fear, laughing seemed like a transgression. Over time, unexpected gestures emerged. A guard offered gum to a group of prisoners during a break from work. They accepted, chewing cautiously. One of them, not understanding, swallowed the gum. The Americans laughed loudly, shaking their heads. The Japanese man blushed, but then laughed too. It was a small, almost insignificant moment, but the kind of moment that began to undermine the image of the enemy constructed by propaganda. Not all encounters were mild. Once, a group of prisoners was taken to help on a nearby farm. The farmer, whose son had died in the Pacific, watched them with restrained hatred. When one of the men dropped a shovel, the American spat on the ground and muttered something that no one needed to translate. The guard next to him noticed, but did not react. Tension hung in the air. Upon returning to the camp, the prisoners commented in low voices, "Not everyone follows the rules." Their companion replied, "Neither they nor us. They are men, not gods." Inside the tents, the nights were long. Some prisoners prayed quietly, invoking their ancestors. Others just stared at the ceiling, trying to understand whether what they were experiencing was luck or humiliation. One of them wrote in his diary, "The enemy feeds us, warms us, and teaches us. Is this betrayal or just survival?" The doubt became an invisible wound. Propaganda had taught them that surrender erased honor, but the reality of Camp McCoy showed that survival could be dignified, or at least bearable. This realization eroded their deepest certainties. One night, a prisoner, lying silently, whispered, "If we go home, what will we tell our children? That the enemy gave us food? That they treated us with respect?" His colleague beside him took a while to respond. "We will tell the truth," he murmured, "even if it hurts." The truth, however, was confusing. It was made up of simple gestures: the guard who helped a man get up, the teacher who taught a word, the American child who one day came over the fence and offered a piece of chocolate. The prisoner who received that candy was paralyzed. He had faced bombings and hunger, but nothing had disarmed him as much as that gesture. When he accepted the gift and said "thank you" in hesitant English, he felt tears welling up. That night, he told his colleagues, "An enemy child fed me. How can I hate a child?" These moments did not erase his loyalty to the emperor, nor the trauma of defeat, but they left something stronger: the realization that hatred was a fragile construct. Humanity, even behind bars, resisted. The months dragged on, and the men no longer knew whether time was passing too slowly or too quickly. The camp had become a world apart, governed by its own laws and its own irony. Inside the fences, they discovered a kind of life they had not expected. Not freedom, but existence. Not victory, but survival. Outside, the snow began to melt, heralding the approach of a new season. And with it, new news. The war outside was changing, and rumors began to cross the gates. There was talk of defeats, of cities in ruins, of a Japan under siege. Each piece of news was a needle stuck in the prisoners' hearts. Inside the camp, however, nothing changed. Hamburgers were still served, Coca-Colas still clinked on the tables, and English words continued to echo in night classes. The monotony was the starkest possible contrast to the chaos of the world beyond the barbed wire. And little by little, every man at Camp McCoy began to understand a truth that could not be taught by decree. Sometimes what really destroys a belief is not force, but kindness; not humiliation, but the constancy with which someone treats you as human when you no longer consider yourself one. It was this constancy, silent, steadfast, almost banal, that began to shape a kind of rupture, deeper than any military defeat, because, deep down, the prisoners weren't just being fed. They were being confronted with something the Empire had never taught them. The enemy could also be fair, and that discovery, more than any bomb, would be what remained alive long after the war ended. By the winter of 1945, the rhythm at Camp McCoy had become predictable, almost numbing. The bugle call, the hot coffee, the moderate work, the censored letters. The prisoners knew what to expect at every hour of the day, and yet something in the air had changed. The silence between the men was heavier, the conversations shorter. On the other side of the world, the empire they had fought for was beginning to crumble, and rumors were coming in through the guards, Red Cross reports, and glimpses of newspapers. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The word surrender whispered in the cold wind. When confirmation came, Japan had surrendered. The entire camp fell into a kind of quiet that did not feel like relief. For many, it was not the end of the war, but the collapse of meaning. Men who had sworn to die for the emperor were now alive, protected, fed, inside an enemy camp. The victory they never imagined seeing had become defeat, and defeat, paradoxically, had kept them breathing. Some reacted with silent tears, others stared at the ground for hours, without saying a word. One soldier tore up a letter from his wife, not out of anger toward her, but because he no longer knew who he was. The news of the surrender spread through the camp like a silent wave, and the American guards, perhaps understanding the weight of the moment, did not celebrate. They simply followed their routine: meals, inspections, orders. This absence of triumph was, for the prisoners, the deepest blow. "They treat us the same," muttered one man bitterly. "Even defeated, they don't despise us." Is that pity or indifference? While the world celebrated the end of the war, Camp McCoy began to lose hope. Repatriation was being prepared. Doctors checked the prisoners, lists were organized, and the men received clean uniforms for the return trip. Most walked in silence, each step carrying a mixture of guilt and fear. Returning home was not a reward. It was a burden. They knew what awaited them: ruined cities, starving families, looks that would not forgive the fact that they had survived. On the morning of their departure, the camp gate opened for the first time to let them out. They carried few belongings: yellowed letters, carved pieces of charcoal, notebooks with secret notes. Some turned to look at the camp one last time. None of them knew whether the feeling that washed over them was gratitude, shame, or confusion. There, where they had expected suffering, they found something that disarmed them more than pain: humanity. During the crossing back to Japan, the sea seemed to reflect the uncertainty on their faces. Their conversations mingled with the sound of the waves. "What will we say?" one of them asked. "That the enemy fed us meat and sugar while our people starved?" No one answered. The answer could not be put into words. When they disembarked, they found what they feared: cities turned to ashes, families missing, children starving. Some were greeted with tears, others with silence and contempt. "Cowards," whispered an old man by the side of the road. None of them argued. Each man carried his own sentence engraved in his memory: the sweet taste of Coca-Cola, the smell of a hot hamburger, the memory of a gesture of compassion that now seemed too painful. Over the years, few spoke about what they had experienced at Camp McCoy. Japan was trying to rebuild not only its buildings but also its dignity, and stories of humanity from the enemy had no place in the narratives of heroes and martyrs. Some former prisoners, now elderly, told their children fragments of what they remembered: not the battles, but the small gestures. The guard who showed a photo of his family, the chocolate offered by a child, the sound of gas escaping from a glass bottle. These seemingly mundane details became sweet and bitter ghosts in their memories. One of them wrote, many years later, "I thought the enemy would break me with pain, but it was with food that he made me rethink everything. The taste of bread, meat, and sweetness haunted me more than any wound. I discovered that kindness is harder to bear than cruelty. Cruelty can be confronted. Kindness, we never forget." The story of Camp McCoy is not one of battle, but of a quieter confrontation: that of human consciousness in the face of the unexpected. In times of war, the image of the enemy is shaped to justify hatred, but in that camp, under the cold of the American Midwest, soldiers of an empire discovered that the enemy also knew how to be fair, that order and humanity could coexist, even surrounded by barbed wire. Today, looking back on this forgotten episode, it is impossible not to ask, what really won that war? Was it the force of arms, or the moral strength of those who offered bread to a prisoner? Perhaps the most lasting victory was the simple act of recognizing the other as human, even when the whole world said otherwise. In the end, the hamburgers and Coca-Colas at Camp McCoy became more than symbols of abundance. They became proof that, even at the height of destruction, there was still room for compassion. And that realization, that the enemy can be kind, that war can contain small acts of peace, was perhaps the greatest challenge those men faced in their entire lives. The voices of the past still echo in the pages of reports and surviving memories, reminding us that wars end, but human choices continue to define who we are. And amid the cold, hunger, and defeat, a simple bottle of Coca-Cola served without hatred showed that humanity, even when wounded, can survive. If you had lived at that time, what do you think might have been different? Would kindness have changed the course of the war, or just the hearts of those who witnessed it? Write in the comments what you believe this story still teaches us about human nature. Like the video, share it with someone who also values the power of empathy, and subscribe to the channel